Uh, Hello, everybody. Just as ever, allowing people to find their seats as Zoom boots up. It's lovely to be with colleagues again, and hello to new colleagues. My name is Barry Colfer, and amongst other things, I'm a research fellow in politics at St Edmunds College at the University of Cambridge. And it's my delight to welcome you to this instalment of the Cambridge seminar on the future of the island of Ireland. We're absolutely thrilled to be welcomed by an enormously significant figure from Irish politics of the last century, Pat Cox. Pat is going to talk to us about the war in Ukraine and the future of the EU. I'll introduce Pat and also our moderator for today, who's a colleague, was initially a favorite teacher of mine and who is now a favorite colleague of mine, Julie Smith, for whom I'm delighted to say I do some teaching in Cambridge. So Julie, thank you again for taking the time to be with us. It's the first time in the 3.5 years of this series that we've asked the moderator back, actually, because you moderated a session back in the day, Julie, if you remember, with Lucinda Crichton, a very good session.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for taking the time. So to introduce Pat and to introduce Julie before handing over to them very quickly, Pat Cox is an Irish politician, journalist, presenter, and former president of the European Parliament. Pat's political career has seen him move between life as an MEP for Munster, my own home constituency, and indeed a TD for Cork South Central. In the European Parliament, Pat was also served as president of the ELDR group, the Liberal group, from 1998 to 2001, becoming the first Irish politician to lead a political group in the Parliament. In 2004, Pat was awarded Germany's prestigious Charlemagne Prize for his achievements with regard to the enlargement of the EU and his work in promoting greater EU democratization. Pat is currently involved in various European institutions, including my other hat at the IIEA in Dublin, the Jean Monnet Foundation for European Development, and the European Investment Bank, amongst other things. But importantly, notwithstanding all that very important track record that Pat has made, his contribution to European politics is enormous. He also has a long-standing relationship with Ukraine, which long predates the current ongoing terrible war. It goes back at least 12 years. This amounts to between 70 and 80 visits to Ukraine, Pat says, and including many since the war. And Pat is deeply involved with the politics of that country and with its institutions. And I'm sure Pat will colour in a little bit more during his presentations, his long and meaningful attachment to Ukraine. Pat is going to be in conversation with Professor Julie Smith, Baroness Smith of Newnham, who's Professor of European Politics in the Department of Politics and International Studies here at Cambridge. Julie was the director of the European Centre at Polis, the Department of Politics and International Studies, between 2013 and 2019. Julie's expertise includes all facets, or many facets, I should say, of European politics. And Julie was head of the European programme at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, from 1999 to 2003. Julie's been a member of the House of Lords since 2014, and as a member of the Lords International Relations Committee from its creation in 2016 until 2021. Julie's main academic interests currently are in the history and politics of the EU, with a particular focus on the UK's relations with the European Union. Without further ado, just again, thanks to both of you for being with us, and I hand over to you, Pat.
Okay, so good evening. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased to join you. I have to resile from all of those things about the enormity of my contribution. Otherwise, I would get a bit bashful. So let me just tell you quickly on the personal links. I've been involved with Ukraine for the past 12 years. That has been first with President Alexander Kwasniewski of Poland on a mission to deal with selective justice, where the former president Yanukovych seemed, in the view of Western jurists, to abuse the criminal code to put some of his potential rivals into prison. We got some of them out, or we got others kept in better conditions than might have been the case, and in the end they were all out. So that was my beginning. The European Parliament then signed a memo after the Maidan revolution with the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament in Kyiv. They decided that they should pick some person of standing, I suppose, from the superannuated great and good, and my name was acceptable to both sides. And I produced a report available on a website in the European Parliament called the Needs Assessment Mission. We invited 66 people's deputies, MPs from Kiev to come to the European Parliament. We presented the report. They went home filled, by their own words, with the spirit of Brussels, and by a large majority, they adopted a resolution to support the reform process. Of course, everyone wants reform in principle, but they get stuck on a bit in practice. So not much was actually happening other than the goodwill and this so-called spirit of Brussels. So we set up a dialogue process called the Jean Monnet Dialogues, so-called because Jean Monnet's particular contribution, I think, to European integration was always to search for the common interest. And we got them together in Monnet's home in a rural part of France, south of Versailles, and we sat them down and started a very intense process of mediation, and we made a good bit of progress. I would say the big outcome, as distinct from the outputs, which I won't bore you with, is the beginning of understandings on their part about methodologies for developing multi-party consensus in a contested political environment. So that's my connection, many visits to Ukraine, including visits since the war. In terms of remarks, I'm going to hop, skip and jump through a number of topics. I think 10 years ago, so 2014 is a really important moment. In fact, if I go back 11 years ago, the Maidan protest started on the 21st of November, 2013. That was the day when, sat in his office, President Yanukovych told Kwasniewski and myself Ukraine would press the pause button on signing the association agreement that they had negotiated with the EU. That caused students to go on to Maidan, and in some respects, the rest is history. What happened on Maidan, and I'm not going to dwell on it because it's a whole talk in itself, is that on the 18th of February of 2014, 20 people were killed in Maidan as the government attempted to retake the square from those assembled there. And 2 days later, up to 100 were killed and many hundreds injured. On the 22nd of February of 2014, so just 10 years ago, not quite to the day, Viktor Yanukovych and his elite fled Kiev. And on the 24th of November of 2014, the then government, the interim transition government, charged Yanukovych with mass murder and issued a warrant against him. And think of the date, 10 years later, 24th of February, 2022, so not 10 years later, 8 years later, Putin invaded. So the date had some significance for Putin and for Yanukovych. I think what happened on Maidan is a key to understanding a lot of what followed in Ukraine-Russia relations. Ukrainians wanted change. They didn't want vague promises. They wanted to rid their country of corruption. They saw what was happening with the EU relations as a beacon of some kind of freedom, democracy, hope, opportunity, and so on. And they looked to NATO eventually as a source of security. They looked to their near neighbor, Poland, that had prospered in the years since the collapse of Soviet Union as Ukraine had stagnated. They were choosing to step in a new direction and turning their back on a jaded past. And what happened there, and then with the flight of Yanukovych, I think exhilarated the vast majority of Ukrainians, but outraged Putin, who saw these kinds of revolutions from the bottom up as a threat to his own security and to his own power base. So he immediately defamed what the Ukrainians now call the Revolution of Dignity, which is their term, and dismissed it as an anti-Semitic, Russophobe, neo-Nazi coup. And based on this big self-serving line, with breathtaking opportunity and opportunism, Putin seized control of and annexed Crimea already in March of 2014. This was superficially validated by a referendum, but the referendum itself was conducted in most extraordinary terms. At the same time, pro-Russian protests in Donbass matured into the declaration of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, largely financed, egged on, and secured through Russian-backed separatists, including, as we now know, army people who volunteered their holidays to assist, and retired Russian army personnel who got involved full time. This led to an armed conflict. And so the point I want to make about all of this month, Ukraine is at war for 10 years. The one we notice is the one for the last 2 years. The war in the last 2 years, we know Putin thought he would take Kiev, cut the head off the existing system, perhaps by assassination or imprisonment or the use of both. In the end, the assault in Kiev failed. The invasion started sweeping up through the south, quickly took Kherson, the oblast that connects to Crimea, and also Zaporizhia, and they then intensified their efforts in Luhansk and Donetsk. Mariupol became a kind of a symbol both of attack and resistance. It lasted until the 20th of May 2022 and was left in a pile of rubble after a really intense Russian siege that started on day one of the war. Between August and November of 22, Ukraine prevailed on the battlefield. They drove Russia back from the west bank of the Dnipro River. In November of 22, they liberated the city of Kherson, and they drove Russia from the Kharkiv Oblast. All in all, they liberated 6,000 square kilometers of territory, and that, I think, was greatly to Russia's surprise. In the light of the setbacks, Putin then mobilized some hundreds of thousands more Russians. Lots of young Russians, as you saw, fled the country, and 1,300 were arrested in protests. By the end of 2022, Ukraine anticipated new arms, more ammunition from its allies, and a new and hopefully successful counteroffensive in 23. In 2022, 130,000 square kilometers, 130,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory changed hands, mostly as a Russian land grab, with 6,000 grabbed back. 2022 was very devastating. When I talked to my friends in Kiev with the attacks on the power grid and water supplies, to give you some personal examples, friends live in high rises, as many in Kiev do. They explained the elevators ceased working. The internet was out, so they couldn't even do remote work. Water couldn't be pumped up to the higher floors. They were advised, if you lived high up during air raids, to stay in, not to get out in the streets and head for shelters, to stay between load-bearing walls if they couldn't find a shelter. Friends who lived on the outskirts showed me images from their gardens of parts of Iranian drones that had been shot down from the sky. One who visited his father's graveyard several times in a small country graveyard remarked how the graveyard had more than doubled in size by last summer since the war had begun, and that's universally in every graveyard in the state. Everyone knows someone who's been killed or injured, and everyone knows someone who's fighting on the front, and large numbers not fighting on the front are working frantically as volunteers. There were lots of different standout incidents: the liberation of Snake Island, the sinking of the Moskva flagship on the Russian fleet, the defiant and symbolic huge blast that damaged the Kerch Bridge, which is Putin's pride and joy, connecting Russia to Crimea. The appointment immediately after that of General Surovikin to take command of Russian forces, now missing in action. I don't know what his whereabouts are, but he had the temerity to get too close to Prigozhin, who got too cheeky for Putin and got taken out. Surovikin came with a sturdy and vicious reputation from the destruction of Aleppo in Syria, and they launched the biggest strike against Kiev up to that point in the war as a response. Russia wasn't asleep at the wheel. The contact line between the two sides stretches now over 1,000 kilometers. To visualize that, it would be the same distance as traveling in a straight line from Dublin to Frankfurt. Russia has mobilized more troops. It unleashed the Wagner private militia. They won the battle for Bakhmut. That lasted for 10 months, ending on the 20th of May 2023, looking like Stalingrad, feeling like Stalingrad, crudely but accurately described as a meat grinder because of the tens of thousands who died and were injured. The sweeping territorial gains of the autumn and winter of 22 were no longer available to Ukraine. Surovikin prepared extraordinary defensive fortifications along the contact line. A multi-layered system, anti-tank ditches, zigzag trenches, concrete dragon's teeth, the barricades of steel hedgehogs, razor wire, and dense minefields and concrete bunkers for protection of troops. Weeks into the counteroffensive, no military obstacle was as daunting for Ukraine as Russia's vast and dense minefields, both anti-tank and anti-personnel. I want you, if you're listening, to imagine that you're not on Zoom, that you're sat in a lecture hall. I've read troops' accounts of that battlefront, which said that there were mines laid every half meter. That means in your lecture hall, under your seat is a mine, and to your left there is a mine, and to your right there is a mine, and to the seats immediately in front and behind you there is a mine. And that is why the counteroffensive was never like or likely to be like what happened a year earlier. I don't believe that these dismissive notions that it failed are correct. It didn't succeed with the hopes that they had generated in 2022. And that's because Russia wasn't stupid in terms of organizing its defense. So everyone learns from war, and Ukraine, for its next tactical wave, has to learn from the lessons of this year. What we do know, in 2023, only 900 square kilometers changed hands, some gained by Ukraine, some gained by Russia. 900 square kilometers 23, 130,000 square kilometers 22. So the war is effectively, as described by General Zaluzny last November in The Economist, it's a war that's somewhat at stalemate. From October to December last, in one of the hotly contested areas west of Bakhmut, the city of Avdiivka, the Institute for the Study of War estimates that Russia in those few months lost 13,000 troops. And that kill rate continues right up to today in this year. In a very Romanov, Stalinist, Orthodox Russian way, they're hurling troops without abandon and at whatever the cost. I think Putin wants to take Avdiivka as a feather in his cap for the March 17 or March 18 presidential elections, which, quote unquote, he is contesting. We'll all be waiting with bated breath to see the result of that contest. And I think he will spend whatever he has to in men and material to get there. So we talked then in the West about assisting Ukraine for as long as it takes. Let's have a quick look at that. I'm not going to develop this at great length. We can come back to it in Q&A. I would commend to you to read the annual report of the Munich Security Conference of March 2020, which developed the very interesting concept of Westlessness, a play on the word restlessness, but talking about the fact that the biggest threat to democracy, freedom, and human rights and so on didn't come from without necessarily China, Iran, Russia, whatever, but risks to come from within by MAGA Americans, to come from within by Viktor Orban style Europeans. And so that concept of restlessness has come into play. It raises questions, which I raise, but I'm not going to answer at the moment, about the role of multilateral institutions without effective multilateralism. And that's in addition to contested multilateralism with an expanded BRICS and so on. What we have on good news is the European Council fixed a 4-year package of 50 billion euros of financial aid for Ukraine. The value in a 4-year cycle is that it allows for some certainty for Ukraine in planning. In the first year and 18 months, finance came in dribs and drabs, and it was hard to set out a financial perspective. That is good news. And finally, we can go back on it if you want, Viktor Orban, at least on this occasion, was bypassed. Super Bowl Sunday, last Sunday, the US Senate was called in, and 67 senators, so a majority over 60 that was required, including Republicans, voted to release aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. This will now go to Congress, where under a MAGA rump and leadership and Trump's insistent pressure, come what may, it probably will be dead on arrival. So we have to wait and see. And of course, since last October and the shocking and grievous Hamas attacks on Israel, what is happening in the Middle East, the shocking events that are unfolding in Gaza, the Yemeni threats, the Iranian threats, the Syrian threats, the Hezbollah threats, the Middle East is, close to something much worse than where it's at even at the moment. And that has displaced a lot of attention on Ukraine. And then we have the European elections coming up, where I'll call Orban and Orbanism will seek to assert a more assertive role. So let's wait and see. I want to turn briefly to internal Ukrainian politics. They have martial law since the beginning of the war, and with it, I think one could hypothesize a creeping degree of centralization around the president and his staff in Bankova, which is the presidential Downing Street, if you want, of Ukraine. The Rada, the parliament, still meets and votes in plenary extraordinarily, although it does most of its work now virtually. There are lots of issues about the extent of pluralist media access, about parliamentary oversight of the executive. There's been no meeting so far with opposition leaders and the president since the first days of the war, when they pledged themselves to unity. I understand there may be a meeting for the second anniversary. If it happens, I would welcome it, and it's long overdue. There will be no elections under the constitution under martial law. At our last Jean Monnet dialogue, all of the political parties agreed not to push for elections under martial law, either legislative or presidential, and happily they all agreed to wait for an interregnum of at least 6 months afterwards to allow the Central Electoral Commission to get on with what's going to be a shockingly challenging electoral voter register, given that you have probably 7 to 8 million internally displaced Ukrainians, several 100,000 on the 1,000-kilometer long contact line, and 5 to 6 million still as displaced persons with refugee status outside Ukraine. Inside the system, nominally they elect 450 people's deputies. In practice, because of Crimea and Donbass, they elected 422. Today, they're down to about 400, and they're unable to hold by-elections under martial law. They have fractured party votes, although there is nominally a mono-majority Servant of the People Party of President Zelensky. In fact, that's now fractured. It's not the only one. When they vote, sometimes people are absent for reasons of war, for health, for whatever. And so mobilizing the necessary 226 votes to pass stuff is getting progressively more difficult. Everyone, when I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, agreed that the war will certainly last this year because no one has an interest in giving in this year. And Putin certainly will at a minimum wait until he sees what happens in the US elections. They've got a lot to do. They've got a conscription law which is contested and hasn't yet happened. They're talking about a lustration law to show up Moscow-friendly types who are residuals still in the body politic. They're talking about budgets with IMF conditionality, never easy politics. They're talking about whatever comes in on EU acquis. All that is tough. Into that mix, throw the row between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, where Zelensky has replaced his popular commander since the beginning of the war by his number 2, General Syrskyi. There was a lot of argument about whether Zaluzhny should have published his stalemate article in The Economist. But what I can tell you, I have you won't see it here, but I've got an opinion poll. It's blank. I think you can't see it. It's there in my hand. That showed that General Zaluzhny was the most popular figure in Ukraine with a rating of 90%, more popular than the still very popular president, but whose popularity is declining compared to its high point also of 90%. So there's lots of stuff on the surface and under the surface about that. How will they mobilize the numbers needed? It's an open question. What will be the consequences of Zaluzhny being replaced? It's an open question. What we do know is that Zaluzhny talked about the need for more technology, for more upgrades. I think Ukraine is going to go down that road one way or another, and will be forced into more domestic initiatives to do with arms and armaments in the context. Right now, today, to do with the war, to do with supplies, I read that Russia is firing 10,000 shells a day, outgunning Ukraine by a factor of 5 along the 1,000-kilometer contact line. What happens? Europe is trying to ramp up its industrial capacity to deliver arms and ammunition. It won't get there probably to its peak preferences in this calendar year. It will be better than last year. It's not enough to replace a lagging US. Then on the EU, quickly to finish out, no enlargement has ever taken place in the EU under such complicated circumstances. EU member states can accelerate or procrastinate the enlargement process through state unanimity. They needed unanimity to open negotiations, and despite Viktor Orban, they got there. They need unanimity to open the negotiating mandate for chapters. That has to yet happen. They need unanimity to close chapters. That, of course, has to happen when the time comes. And they need unanimity for the final ratification of accession treaties. So lots can happen for states that want to push it, and lots can happen for states that want to push against it. Ukraine already is partway in with its association agreement and deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement, so it's not starting from zero. I think we can bolt on other things like energy policy, transport policy, and so on, that are pre-accession ways of accelerating the process. For EU veterans, and I think Professor Smith being among them, enlargement has always raised the classic debate between deepening and broadening. So the Union has issues of absorption capacity, which it's got to deal with, and Ukraine has issues of absorption capacity. I just want to point out to you a few quick things. Based on its internationally recognized de jure borders, including Crimea, Ukraine is a very large state. It's second only in size to Russia. It's very marginally smaller than France, larger than Sweden, twice the size of Italy, and 1 3/4 times the size of Germany. In agriculture, its share of agriculture as a share of GDP is a significant multiple of the EU average share. In terms of per capita income, it's very poor at just about 1/4 of the per capita income of Poland. In summary, it's big, it's agricultural, and it's poor. 3 big things impacting who gets what and who gives what to EU budgets, another complication. So whether it's in budgetary terms or institutional terms about majority voting and vetoes and so on, there's a lot to be done on the EU side, a lot to be done on the Ukrainian side. What I think is clear is if we look from an EU strategic perspective, and I will finish on this, if we look from a strategic perspective at Ukraine, we don't need a diminished, weak, failed state and economy on our eastern border. Because if that was the case, it will become the fulcrum for instability within Central and Eastern Europe itself. So this fulcrum about which the thing is tilting like a seesaw is, for me, in summary, a geostrategic question. Are we going to find a balance that allows for a peaceful, prosperous, sustainable Ukraine, whatever the details are territorially, that gives to us a European stability? Or will we let it slip, whether through Trumpism or populism, that will yield for Putin a victory that is likely to enhance his adventurous capacity, that started in Georgia, that talked about defending co-ethnics in Crimea who weren't even being attacked, that talked about genocide which never happened in Donbass, and who now denies in his most recent interview that he has any intention ever of going for Poland or the Baltic states. As I might remind you, he swore through a bucket he had no intention ever of invading Ukraine, as the United States commented on the buildup of forces on its northern and eastern borders. So that's where it is. I think there's a lot at stake. I'm very much for Ukraine. So what you see behind me is simply, you could see my ill-kept office, or you could see this symbolic flag. And to me, the symbolism matters. I'm with them. It is a long haul. We need to do what Mario Draghi did with the euro. We need to do whatever it takes. And if we do that, it will be good for them. But it will also be good for us. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a million, Pat. That was phenomenal as ever. There will be time for those on the call to put questions at the end. We will have a couple of minutes. I'll probably have one or two myself as well. They'll probably be the most parochial part of the call pack, so I'll probably ask one or two things about Ireland. But for now, we're really, really fortunate to have a real expert in European politics in Julie Smith. If you'd like to take the floor, Julie, to ask Pat some questions.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you very much indeed, Pat, for such a comprehensive introduction to the topic of Ukraine and Europe and the wider implications of the war. I think it has been extremely salutary to sit and listen, not just to the narrative of the last 10 or 12 years, but the very detailed assessment of the situation on the ground, the domestic politics, but the international relations. So thank you very much indeed for that. I very much hope this session, I know it's been recorded, can be disseminated widely, because I was having a private conversation the other day with a relative who said, to her shame, she had never really fully been aware of what had happened in 2014. And this is somebody who is very aware of international politics normally. And yet somehow in this country, we seem very often to miss a lot of very important international issues, unless it is something that appears to affect the United Kingdom directly. And for good or ill, although obviously I was very aware of the annexation of Crimea at the time. And while I do not have a Ukrainian flag behind me today, I did have a Ukrainian flag at the time at the Liberal Democrat conference in March of 2014, when we were having an emergency debate about Ukraine. But I think the situation in this country, as in many others, reflects the fact that for most people, most ordinary citizens, and hence most political leaders, there is a tendency to focus on the domestic, to forget about the international. And given that this is a year when so many countries are holding general elections, including, we assume, the United Kingdom, we've got that sense that although the Prime Minister might still be saying the right things about Ukraine, and I think the British government has been saying and doing the right things about Ukraine since February 2022, there is the danger that public opinion won't be as interested in what's happening in Ukraine as it is actually in what's happening in Gaza and in what's happening in terms of the NHS and other issues that are going to be on the domestic agenda. So what I'd really like to do is ask you a few questions about where you think support is at present, because you've touched on the situation of funding from the United States. We've also, in the last 36 hours, been hearing Donald Trump making utterances about NATO allies, which are truly shocking, but also, I think, reinforce the need for European countries, whether in the European Union or like the UK and Turkey outside the European Union, European NATO members need to be thinking about what we're doing and what solidarity we can provide, because we can't rely on the United States. And I think that is something that international relations scholars could have been saying for some time, but I think it's now filtering into the wider discourse in the media. So what recommendations would you give to an incoming British Prime Minister? What recommendations would you make to the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany? But also And Barry said he would ask some parochial questions about Ireland, but what recommendations to the Taoiseach as well? So that's one set of questions about international support and advice. But linked to that, you said that your first visit to Ukraine was actually alongside the then Polish president. And I'm wondering, how do you see support in Europe at the moment? Because clearly with the previous peace government, there were some difficulties about ongoing support for Ukraine. There's been a change of regime in Poland. Clearly there's an opportunity for a much stronger governmental support for Ukraine. But is the Polish public as strongly behind the government and behind Ukraine as we might hope? And I suppose finally, in sort of this set of questions, because obviously I want you to have a chance to answer and other people to get in, would be the situation on the ground in Ukraine, the fact that there won't be elections during martial law, and that's clearly understandable at one level. But are the citizens in Ukraine, as you said, they were more in favour of the general who's just been sacked than Zelensky, even though Zelensky remains popular? Are there undercurrents of concern, or should we understand from our Western perspective that the citizens of Ukraine are behind Zelensky, and that any suggestions of frustration among the citizens of Ukraine, that there's maybe a loss of support among the young people who might be going to fight, things like that, are they fake news that are permeating into the West? And can you reassure us that the spirit is still just as willing in 2024, 2 years after the invasion of Eastern Ukraine, as it was 2 years ago? So I think I will stop there.
So let me start with the last question on no elections. That clearly is always an issue about legitimacy. And the reason why we began discussing with the Verkhovna Rada factions, as they call the parties there, was to try to get an agreement, if we could, firstly among them, that they would not begin in their domestic debate to start a debate on delegitimizing the next elections because the voter register was wrong or whatever, and there's so much room to contest on things like that. And I mentioned earlier that they agreed to follow the constitution, no elections under martial law, and no elections at least for 6 months after it had ceased. What I was pleased to see in the opinion poll that I mentioned to you, that this view was supported by 80% of those polled. And these are telephone polls, they're large representative samples, they're done on a regular basis and have been done now for almost 2 decades. So I would regard them as, reputable sources of a reasonable estimate of the state of public opinion at any point in time. I think to do with the support for Zelensky, that's still so high that any leader in Western Europe or in the United States would give their right arm for it. So if it has come down a bit, it came down from, stellar stratospheric levels. But there's no doubt as the war drags on and things get difficult and victories don't kind of flow easily in your direction, as the body count inevitably rises, and with the anxieties that people have about, if I am in the army, will I have the arms and ammunition to sustain me? So I think there's a kind of a chicken and egg quality here. If we don't muscle up on provisioning what Ukraine needs, we impact its own internal dynamics. But there's no doubt that people who recruit in Ukraine are finding recruitment much more difficult than 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the existential threat to the state was manifest. People understood it implicitly, and waves of people volunteered. Many of those are dead or injured. Many of them are still involved in the front line with modest short 2-day rotations off the line, but only very occasionally back to see family, and they are physically and psychologically traumatized and exhausted. And so if you don't replenish that supply, you have a double jeopardy, one of which is a diminution in fighting capacity of those already there, and the second is the lack of this kind of rotation and development. So I don't know how much of the reported tension between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky fits around this issue. Zelensky did give a statement one evening some months ago, saying that General Zaluzhny wanted another 500,000 to be mobilized. Zaluzhny, in a recent op-ed for CNN, has denied that he'd ever put that number on it. Whatever the truth about the number, a large number would be needed because Russia keeps mobilizing prisoners or poor people from poorer parts of the Federation who are happy to draw the pay but take the risk, and whose families are happy for them to take the risk because of the payout for death and injury afterwards. So all of that is a real challenge. It was clear that Zelensky passed this hot potato to the cabinet of ministers, who then passed the hot potato onto the Verkhovna Rada, and they were unable so far to come to a consensus on the conscription law. I'm presuming they will do that as a matter of urgency, but they raised all sorts of constitutional questions around aspects of the surrounding terms and conditions, that if you didn't show up, you risked, and I'm exaggerating here to avoid going on too long, you risked to become almost a stateless citizen. Your bank account wouldn't work, you couldn't really reboot your car license or whatever. So there's all sorts of bits around the edges that are in the way of all of that. So I think if you look at it, they are resilient, they are courageous, they are determined still to fight on. That has not diminished, but they are fatigued and they are stressed. And these two phenomena are interplaying. The greater weight is with not giving in, but the other elements are weighing in. In terms of Poland and Polish public support was, and I think at its core, remains high. What are the negatives, since you asked about it? So I think it's net positive. What are the negatives? Polish heavy goods vehicles drivers started to object to the fact that the borders were opened to HGV drivers from Ukraine with cabotage rights. They were treated as if they were EU, and they had different costs and maybe different standards. I don't know all of that. And the Poles felt they were losing out. And as you saw, they started to block the borders and gum everything up. Polish farmers, not unique, farmers also in other Central Eastern European states, objected to the reduction in the price of domestic grain as a result of the EU agreeing to open grain exports from Ukraine as if those exports were part of the single market. And I think part of the recent climb down, I don't know all of the fine detail, with Ursula von der Leyen and the EPP and others now bending a knee to farmer protests in Europe and trying to shore up that flank for the European Parliament votes, agreed that they will introduce some restrictions on those elements. I don't have the full detail of those restrictions in mind. And finally, there's a very large number of Ukrainians who used to work in Poland anyway, as migrant workers, and now the very large influx of refugees. The geographic proximity and the degree of linguistic proximity helps all of that. Mostly that support is there, but there is a higher end of Ukrainian refugee in quote marks who was rich enough to afford some of the most expensive and luxurious apartments in the center of Warsaw. And that kind of conspicuous consumption has popular blowback and pushback. But I do think that Donald Tusk is a committed European. He is a former president of the European Council, and he is not going to give in to what I would regard as street-based populism to do with Poland's strategic interests. On NATO and Trump, generally on Trump, I think he as an individual and the MAGA movement represent the greatest single threat to post-war multilateral institutions. He represents the greatest single threat to NATO as a military alliance. He represents the greatest single threat to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And disgracefully, he is prepared to instrumentalize his attitudes on Ukraine and his proximity to strongmen like Putin for electoral purposes, almost regardless of the cost. And that to me is shocking, frightening, and a perspective that I find extremely challenging for our collective future. So what does it mean, to go to your first question? It means if we can read the writing on the wall, even with the distraction of Gaza, and legitimate distraction, what we're witnessing is another horror unfolding before our eyes. But what it tells us is, when you ask about different individual politicians in different states, it's not so much that I would, choose to offer gratuitous advice to political leaders who have to go out and fight elections and take everything into account, but to do with this question, what we need above and beyond merely being politicians is the men and women who lead us to be statesmen and stateswomen, to have the big picture and the long view. So it's not so much advice as an appeal. Please do your politics, win your election. But when you're there, in addition to all of the events, to quote Macmillan, that drag you this way and that, be a statesman or a stateswoman that rises above the quotidian and sees the bigger picture. And if you look at the bigger picture, Ukraine is that fulcrum of which I spoke, around which hinges a geostrategic stability or instability for our continent. And I would close by saying, whatever they have done on other domains, and whoever they are as persons, I would pay a tribute to the consistent engagement of consecutive British prime ministers, without whose early arming Kiev would have fallen. I don't give many credits to Boris Johnson, but I give him a big credit on that one, because the early arming with potentially offensive stroke defensive weapons saved Kiev, and saving Kiev saved Ukraine for the moment, and saving it for the future is now the challenge.
Thank you very much indeed. I think, Barry, shall I hand back to you? There are a couple of questions that have come in, so I think we probably ought to.
There's a couple of
allow
questions
them to come
indeed,
in.
so we might go through those, Julie, and at the end I'll hand back to you to see if you have any kind of wrap up question. But I guess on Johnson, Pat, credit where credit's due. I think good point, well made. I've a small question, and then there's questions in from the audience, including one from Estonia. And I just mentioned that because, Pat, I was in Vilnius last week, and with researchers and colleagues from the Baltics and from Finland and Sweden and Poland and Germany. And something I really picked up was the kind of threat perception in that part of the world is just very vivid. Me coming from my position between Ireland and the UK, I get the threat of further Russian advancement into other parts of Europe beyond Ukraine. I get that in the abstract, but kind of in the real kind of lived experience, I guess, proximity to the border just makes this much more acute, and also the history of the region. I just want to ask you, can you comment broadly on that risk, as it is perceived, if Putin is not overrun in Ukraine, if he is not driven from Ukraine, what is the legitimate risk to the rest of Europe? And relatedly, this whole conflict and your presentation, can you comment on how this has been framed in Ireland, especially with respect to this threat perception? Is the threat being adequately framed within the Irish public discourse, or is it being underplayed by act or omission?
Okay, two interesting questions. I'm not surprised if you're in Estonia that the threat perception was vivid, and they are dead right. And that is true of Lithuania, and that is true of Latvia also. So let's look at it. I mean, Putin lied about whether he would invade Ukraine. Putin lied about what was happening in eastern Ukraine. And I'm sure, in my own view, he lied in this infamous Tucker Carlson interview when he said he had no interest in these other states. I can refer people back to speeches that he's given, which expressly mentioned those other states as part of the overall ambition for the restoration of a post-Soviet Russian near abroad. So he's already, on the record talking about those things. The threat perception is very vivid, to take a really kind of tight example from which one could generalize. Russia has now effectively annexed Belarus. Of course, it's still independent, and Lukashenko is still its leader, and he plays a clever kind of game. But Putin has installed troops in Belarus, including apparently ex-Wagner people, to help train the Belarusian army. He has installed some of Russia's nuclear hardware and capacity in Belarus as part of that nuclear threat, the stick that he waves at the West to try to get them to calibrate and contain the level of support that in the recent past that they've given to Ukraine. He's already, of course, in Kaliningrad, which is on the Baltic coast, and which itself is armed to the teeth with Russia's Baltic fleet, including with nuclear submarines and with various missile systems. So if we take the space between Western Belarus and Kaliningrad, which is in Lithuania, you're talking about a stretch of, I don't know, is it 40 or 60 kilometers between Western Belarus and Kaliningrad, the Suwalki Gap, which is the strategic weak spot. If this was closed off and occupied, or a fighting zone, effectively Poland and Lithuania would be cut off from each other, and the Baltic states would be physically cut off unless NATO was to engage in a fight and win that fight to retain that gap. I think the arrival, a huge strategic error by Putin, the arrival of Finland in NATO, which adds a 1,300-kilometer border, is bad news for Putin, and the imminent arrival, subject to the nonsense blockage and preening attitude of Orban to getting Sweden in as a full member, which is now long overdue, actually greatly strengthens NATO, because these were both two neutral states, but with a very strongly armed capacity to defend their neutrality. So they will bring a lot to NATO along that whole Baltic front. And that brings me then to the Irish question you ask. We're far away. We're an island behind an island on the western seaboard of the European continent, and we're as far away in European Union as you can get from Ukraine. I think the Irish response to taking Ukrainian refugees up to this point has been very commendable. I think the Irish engagement, the government is very careful to walk, as you know, a tightrope between engagement and watching its political flank about not being accused of entering military alliances and so on. I'm pleased to see that we're looking at deepening our engagement with NATO to do with NATO's assistance to help our underdeveloped and underfunded military and naval capacity to protect our strategic maritime interests in respect of power supplies, interconnectors, and internet connections. If you take the modern Irish economy, and in particular its high-tech sector, the internet links are the life stream of modern Irish economics. And if they were cut, it would be a shocking disaster for Irish economics. So we have to understand in Ireland, in ways perhaps that we don't, that the threat perception which the government is trying to address with these deepening relationships is not necessarily about simply switching from being 100% out of something to being 100% in, so much as to rationally choosing engagements which are in the strategic interest of the state and of the economy. For my own part, so not to to kind of mince my words, I believe with or without Ireland, because Ireland has, and let me point out, as you know, a protocol attached to the European treaties, which recognises the special status of Ireland with regard to military neutrality. And that protocol has the same effect as an article of the treaty. So it can only be changed by unanimity, and Ireland would have to give its unanimity. So those who've argued, and I've been in every referendum except the first one, who argue that if you vote for this next European treaty, whatever it was, Amsterdam, Nice, Maastricht, Lisbon, that you were giving up Irish neutrality, I've never bought it. Indeed, my opinion was that the people who argue that were lucky that neutrality isn't virginity, because if it was, we serially would have lost it, but regained it in time again for the next referendum. So Europe needs to take steps. And with or without Ireland, I supported taking those steps because of the statesman point I made earlier. Something big is in the balance. And something that happened right at the beginning of the European process with Robert Schuman. He talked about taking actions proportionate to the dangers which threaten us. We're at one of those defining moments about the threats that we have. And it demands of us taking actions proportionate to those threats.
Thanks a million, Pat. With the couple of minutes that remain, I've picked two questions that I'm going to put to you from the audience, and thanks for everyone who's submitted questions. The first one, I'll put them to you together. The first is from Jay Shelton. Jay asks, what support are the EU providing or should provide to countries such as Moldova, who, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, will be under a specific threat? And then this was the question from the Baltics, or from somebody from the Baltics. Hello, Christian Kies, good to have you here. Christian asks, what was the nature of the discussions within the European Parliament during the 2004 enlargement process to incorporate Central and Eastern Europe? Were there any notable parties who expressed apprehension towards enlargement east of Berlin? If so, what were their motives? And how do they relate to Euroscepticism today, if at all? If you have anything to say to either of those questions, Pat.
Okay, great questions. On Moldova, Moldova is a very small state, part of whose territory is already occupied by Russia in Transnistria. You heard some of the Russian generals after the invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago saying their objective was to take not just Zaporizhia and Kherson on the south, but to extend it over to Odessa and on to Transnistria. Moldova has a very divided politics with a huge amount of dirty Russian money washing around the system, and a constant seesaw battle between Euro integration forces and Moscow forces financed out of FSB and others and oligarchic interests. The EU is making considerable efforts with Moldova. I'm pleased to see that Moldova also got candidate status, and Moldova also got negotiating status, even though so much needs to be done. They are small, they are isolated, but they deserve the support. You saw this European political cooperation that Macron recommended. The UK is there, all of the European countries are there. It's almost, but not quite, like a mirror image of the membership of the Council of Europe. They don't have an agenda, but everyone can come and talk about the key issues. And they don't have the agenda, so they don't have to go home and be divided on things. And I was really pleased to see its second or third meeting, it meets every 6 months, was held in Chisinau, in the capital of Moldova, symbolically saying, we're here, you're us, and we're with you. And the other thing I know, I've some great friends, one of them an absolutely brilliant Polish diplomat who is almost full-time engaged, assisting Moldova with all of the technical aspects of its EU applications and so on. So there's a lot going on there to support it, and it is a lot of goodwill. But as I said earlier, this is a complicated process where the EU has its own absorption capacity issues that it must address, and each of these states have their own issues, and they will get in due course at their own speed as they deliver, and hopefully as the EU is prepared to take them. The 2004 enlargement, the whole process towards that began with Europe agreements in around 1992. and completed in the first Big Bang enlargement in 2004. So that took a 12-year cycle. The debate in the European Parliament at the time largely was that debate about broadening and deepening. People saying, well, you can't enlarge if you don't sort out the rule book and sort out our voting and get more qualified majority voting, etc. So the reason why the EU did Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, a constitutional treaty that failed, and Lisbon was all part of a process of trying to right itself in the right direction. It hasn't got to the end of that journey, but that's what that was all about. In the Parliament itself, there were those who said no enlargement without getting all these other EU conditions correct. My view was, if I might borrow a phrase used in Northern Ireland, one of those elegant turns of phrase, authored by him or not, I don't know, but expressed by Tony Blair, that they were touched by the hand of history. I felt continental Europe, divided it had been after the Second World War, had a moment of history challenging it to seize the moment. And so my view was, for sure, we need to clean up our own act, but in the end, we need to bring the guys in. And we did that, and I think it was the right view. And were there loose ends, and did some things turn out different to what one had expected? The answer certainly is yes. But it was the right choice, and I would still stand over it as having made sense. Because the thing we know about EU enlargement, and this is for Ukraine or for Moldova also, this is not trying to unify whatever theory you have about history of Ukraine and Russia and so on. It's not trying to unify peoples and territories from the barrel of an ideological or post-imperial gun. It is about the free and sovereign choice of free peoples. And that's what I've always loved about the European project. And I deeply regret myself that Britain chose to leave. But Britain's exit is a proof of the voluntary nature a fortiori. Not only do you need a referendum or a parliamentary majority to come in, but if you want to go out by referendum or parliamentary majority, no one's going to stand with a gun at the doorstep and shoot you on the way out. And so to me, it's the voluntary engagement that mattered. It's the voluntary engagement that won in 2004, in spite of critics. And there were lots of bits. I mean, think of the budget, which is always a big issue, and lots of rows, but we got there in the end. I remember a row, Jacques Chirac, President of France, having to give more money into an EU budget to support enlargement, blowing a gasket on the margins of a summit because Poland was using money to buy US F-16s instead of French Mirage jets. And he's wondering, how come I'm giving them a subsidy to join Europe and they're spending other money to support US industry and so on. All that stuff goes on. But above all that stuff, statesmen and stateswomen have to realize there are bigger things at stake. And so the enlargement in 2004, in spite of the whiners and whingers who might have got in the way, got displaced by that determined drive to say, this is the moment, this is the time, and this is the question that has to be answered. And I think we will face such a moment. It's not there yet, because a Ukraine at war will not be joining. But when the war is over, there's all the reconstruction side, there's all the demographic problem to deal with, and who stays where and who goes where. And there is, in all of this, already a constitutional aspiration in the Ukrainian constitution to be a full member of the Euro-Atlantic community. If Donald Trump doesn't take an axe to a large part of that, that is the community Ukraine wants to join. And if he does take an axe to it, a fortiori must we, the Europeans, create our conditions for our own stability. And dealing with Ukraine and Moldova have to be primary dimensions in dealing with our own stability. And that is my message to begin and end with today. Our stability is at stake. So we've got to wake up and smell the coffee and get doing what we need to do.
Thank you most sincerely, Pat. That was really excellent, and thank you for handling those interesting, challenging questions. Julie, we're at time, but do you want 20 seconds to say anything to Pat?
No, I think I would just thank him again for reminding us of the importance of Ukraine for all of us. It's at the front line of democracy for all of us. And like you, Pat, I'm not a natural supporter of Boris Johnson, but I do think he actually put the UK on the right track in supporting Ukraine. And yeah, I think we can only hope that whoever is Prime Minister after the next election continues giving that support. But
I hope
thank you
so,
so
that they
much.
all find their Churchillian space to do the right thing at the right time.
Exactly.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye to
Thanks,
everyone.
Pat. Thanks, Julie, and Slava Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want a quick thanks to Iona Clark, our research assistant, for putting the event together, and thank you also for you at home who stayed with us. Indeed, the attendance held up nearly 7 minutes past the hour, so it's testament to you, Pat, and to Julie. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.